Hello everyone. I am Deyasini Roy, and I welcome you all to the stories of the Indian Diaspora series with reference to TMYS Reviews June 2021 project that is inviting stories on the Indian diaspora. This is basically to investigate the ambition based movement under our annual theme of migration, resettlement, and displacement. We are honored to present Bhaswati Ghosh. She writes and translates fiction and nonfiction. Her first book of fiction is Victory Colony, 1950, published by Yada Press. Her work of translation from Bengali into English, My Days with Ramking Karbet, has been published by Yogi Books. This work also won her the Charles Wallace Trust India Fellowship for translation in 2009. Her stories have appeared in Letters to My Mother and My Teacher is My Hero, anthologies of true stories published by Attempts Media. Her writing has appeared in several literary journals of repute, including Cargo Literary, Café de Census, Everyday, Pithead Chapel, Worscapes, Earthen Lamb. We welcome you, Bhashwati, and oh, I think we lost her. So let
We
us
lost.
wait for, we
Yeah,
lost her. Let us wait for a few minutes.
I will just give a brief introduction to her book Victory Calling 1950, which actually follows the protagonist Amala Manna, who in 1949 has just crossed over to India from East Pakistan and soon loses her younger brother Karthik. She makes her way to a refugee camp, but as official support dwindles and the camp situation deteriorates, the refugees take matters into their own hands, occupying a zamindar's vacant plot of land and establishing Bijoy Nagar, meaning Victory Colony. This novel actually describes how the refugees
Okay,
built.
so we
Yeah,
have her now.
okay,
We
okay.
welcome you, Bhashwati, and a very good morning to you.
Thanks and
Yeah,
sorry for the
it's absolutely fine. It's
interrupted
absolutely
start.
fine. It's absolutely fine. Uh, we also have Megha Mazumdar joining us today. She is currently a student of English literature, pursuing her master's from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. She has always had a knack for writing, and is also a part-time content writer and proofreader. She's been writing poems since her childhood, and her major turning point in life has been Keats's trans-romantic poems. Megha also takes a keen interest in learning new languages, and she is declarant about her fluency in 7 different languages as of now. She also extends her reach to learning about multilingual poetry, her current areas of interest being Spanish Imagist poetry. Megha is published in several national and international journals, including The Criterion. We welcome you, Megha. And I
Thank
would
you so
now
much.
request, and I would now request Megha to kindly proceed with her questions.
Very warm welcome, ma'am. It is a great honor to have you among us today. So, I will actually start with a quote of yours, which you actually mentioned in your interview in January 2021 with Mr. Chintan Girish Modi, where you say, it was only as I grow up that the apparition of partition, invisible yet ever present in the stories, become apparent to me. So I would like to ask, like, when was this exact time you were quote unquote uprooted from your own grounds and you had to migrate to a new place? And when could you actually internalize this migration within you? And what were the limitations you had to face?
Firstly, thank you to tell me your story and Deyashini Megha for giving me this opportunity. Uh, your question is very pertinent, and I was just thinking about it yesterday as I pondered on our session's theme. Me and my husband, we came to Canada in March 2011. So it has been exactly a decade, since we migrated. And for the first 2 years, we lived in a place called Mississauga in Ontario, which is a part of what is known as the GTA, or the Greater Toronto Area. And then in 2013, we moved to a suburb called London, which is about 2 hours from Toronto. And I remember that in the initial years, every winter, the winter especially was very alienating for me. I would feel so despondent during that time that I would say to my husband every year in the winter time that we needed to relocate to India. The starkness of the extreme winters that we have here, coupled with a sense of isolation, that it brought, it gave me such a hard time. And interestingly, I also remember that it was during the sixth winter in Canada that I finally felt okay. That was the first winter when I stopped whining and didn't mention relocating to India. So I guess that's how long it took me to internalize, 6 years to internalize the migration. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I look at it.
No, no, absolutely. That's perfect. And so, what were these coping mechanisms you had to adopt while you were the entire culture shock and the inevitable diaspora coming along with it? So, what did you exactly do to keep yourself kind of distracted to actually fall into place finally?
Yeah, so I'd say initially the coping mechanism consisted of a need to connect with people like you, your own. I didn't have any family in Canada when we moved. So my husband's friends and their families
Okay, so yeah, yeah, we can see you. We can see you.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
So, my husband's friends from school and university time, their families sort of became our extended family. So we would get together for dinners, other social occasions, and cultural events. And a few months after our arrival, I joined a South Asian weekly newspaper, which kind of opened the doors for me to the wider South Asian community. It wasn't a huge financial gain for me, but it opened meet other members of the community, and I could attend social and cultural events like the South Asian Film Festival and even a Nobobor show celebration, which is the Bengali New Year, which interestingly the Bangladeshi community here celebrates with a lot of warmth and fervor. And then later, as we moved to London, it's a quieter suburb, it's more white, it has a lot less South Asian and Indian community. Our links to the community still continued. It has a smaller community in proportion to the GTA, but we went to the local Durga Puja celebrations here, and also to the local Gurdwara for occasions like Guru Nanak's Jayanti and Guru Gobind Singh's birthday and things like that. And with time, I realized that I could see that we had started moving away from these connections, these community connections, which were based solely on the sense of identity with the community. And I realized that Canada herself has a lot of riches to offer if only one paid it the time and attention. So, in the quieter surroundings of where we now live, London, we found great fulfillment in appreciating nature, in going for walks and trails, and even growing our own food and enjoying the company of birds in our backyard. So that's how I've coped over
that's
the years.
wonderful.
Okay, actually, yeah, sticking to festivals and food and like stuff like this, like natural, easy stuff, actually make us stay rooted to our culture. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Deyasini, for the next
Yeah,
question.
yeah. So, Bhaswati, from the partitioned borders to diasporic borders and checkpoints, how difficult has the weaving of your life around the changing topography of borders been in Canada? We are all aware that your grandparents have started their lives in India as immigrants. So, if you could tell us how their experiences have impacted your own migration to Canada.
Question at the
You're
same
muted.
time. Am I on? Am I unmuted
Yeah,
now?
yeah, yeah. We can hear you. Please continue. Please continue. We can hear
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. So, I feel like this is a loaded and a very good question at the same time. And I've written about this as
Thank
well.
you so.
And I'm grateful that
Thank
you
you so.
asked it. Back in 2014, I got to guest edit an issue of Cafe de Census, where I was
Mhm,
an editor at large for some time. And it was
mhm,
called Care, and it was an issue on diaspora writing. Uh, as a child, I grew up listening to stories that my grandmother repeated over and over again about her village in Borishal in East
mhm.
Bengal. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, that she lost to partition. She lost
Mhm,
her home to partition, and those
mhm,
stories kind of became a wound that found its remedy by scratching itself over and over again. So I
mhm,
would say, in a sense, as you mentioned, I inherited diasporic sensibilities even
mhm,
before I became a member of the diaspora community myself.
mhm, mhm,
And when I became an immigrant, I could sense the agony of longing that my grandmother must have felt in
mhm,
her new surroundings.
mhm,
Because
mhm,
one misses, this is what I wrote, that one misses not just everyday signposts of one's past, the flowers and the tart fruits, the heat and the
mhm,
hailstorm, the friends and the nosy neighbors. One also starts missing imagined yearnings, an impending monsoon, the autumn festivities that everyone back home is sure to greedily indulge in, the toddler nephew's anticipated reaction when his hair is shaved off. The immigrant always oscillates between the living reality of here and the imagined possibility of there. So that push and pull is always going
mhm.
on in an immigrant's experience.
All right. All right. Um, it's great to know that your grandparents were from Borishal. My grandparents were from Borishal too,
Oh,
Bhaswati. Uh, yeah. So over to you, Megha.
Yeah, and absolutely, I could relate with the oscillating part because for you, it's more than changing continents and everything. But even when I like go from one city to the other in the same country, I feel like I'm having a culture shock, and I'm going through so much differences, and coping with it is so difficult. So, okay, I'll move to my next question. So, I would like to know, like, rebuilding one's own culture in a land that is not one's own requires a major shift in language. And as I've gone through some of your works, you kind of eventually tend to develop a translator inside yourself that actually works in your subconscious in some way or the other. And your My Days with Ram Kinkar Beige, which is like one a fine work of translation of yours based on Shomendranath Bandyopadhyay's Shilpi Ram Kinkar Alapchari, that in fact got you the Charles Wallace India Trust Fellowship to proceed with your work, and then you had to move across continents for it. You had to see so many cultures and so many changes. So how do you think this process of going through so many transition and translation was developed by you both as an author and as a migrant in your book?
yeah, it's funny you would ask this. Up until when we were working in office spaces, like physically before March last year, when when I would work in the office, I would often look around the workplace, like in the middle of the day, and wonder why nobody was speaking in Bangla, which is my mother tongue. It was almost as if I expected my colleagues to speak in that language. My unconscious need to hear it must have been that acute. And that was when I would realize, this is not where this language is spoken. So I have to keep my inner translator on at almost all times here, because Outside home, I'm in a sea of Anglophones. But even at home, my husband is a Punjabi and he doesn't speak Bengali. But as the years have passed, I have noticed how interesting it is that, we hold on to the mother tongue more and more as time goes by. I often speak to my husband in Bengali and he
Mhm.
responds in Punjabi, and we perfectly understand each other. So, our both our translators are at work at the same time. We
Mhm.
maintain that link to the mother language as far as possible. And to talk about the book that you mentioned, Shilpi Ramkinkar Alapchari, uh, and the subsequent translation of the book as My Days with Ramkinkar Baij, uh, it sort of happened, very spontaneously, I would say. I was reading the book, which was gifted to my mother by the author who had taught her in Shantiniketan. So, it was a gift to a student. And my mother, when she read the book, she was so taken by it that she kind of goaded me to read it. And I had no inclination initially because I am not a person of art. I'm not a student of art in any way. So I didn't know, what to expect from that book. But my upon my mother's persuasion, I started reading it, and I absolutely fell in love with what I was reading. It was a conversation, and the tone of Ram Kinkar's personality was so infectious. It was as if you were sitting in that room with him, and as the reader, you were having that conversation. And I just out of the love of it, I translated a few chapters and put them up on my blog. And this opportunity of the Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship came about, and I could spend some time in Norwich, UK, where I completed the translation. But more than that, that journey itself of going to the journey as an immigrant, because that was the first time I had stepped out of India, and not only stepped out of a country but also stepped out of a very sheltered life that I had led so far, because I was living, with my family, and I had no experience in living independently. So those 2 months that I spent in Norwich, UK, and in other cities like London, and they were intimidating and liberating at once, because I had to shop for myself, I had to clean for myself, cook, I had to do budgeting, and I also made some solo trips, something I had never done in my life before. So I believe that was sort of a foundation, for my life that would, unfold as an immigrant over the next few years. And also that experience brought me closer to very eminent translators and literary personalities, such as Lakshmi Holmstrom, who translated from Tamil to English, and Amanda Hopkinson, William Radice, and Valerie Henetiok. So interacting with these very eminent practitioners of the craft and learning from them, I believe that helped me grow by leaps and bounds.
Okay, yeah, that was very interesting and extremely enriching. Like through internet, we hardly get to know what you had to personally go through, but hearing everything from you is like extremely shocking and yet so wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So my next, now that we are already talking about translation, so there must be certain voids that you had to fill up, which must have affected your narrative when you are translating a work from a source language to a target language. So, how could you fill these voids, and what changes did you bring in the narrative to fill these voids?
That's an intriguing, and it's kind of a tough question to answer. And in my experience, in my limited experience, because I translate mostly from Bengali, and informally I have translated from Hindi into English. But I'm closest to my mother tongue, so I can speak more about that. The voids are mostly to do with the frustration of not being able to share with non native speakers of your language its particular idiosyncratic nuances that are utterly untranslatable. I'm thinking of Shukumar Ray, and I'm, also thinking of uh, characters like Tenida, for instance. There are certain phrases and turns of language used by the authors that will only make sense. They are so nonsensical in many ways that they only make sense to the speakers of that language. And it is possible to translate these. It's not an impossible task, and it has been done. But unless you can read the source language, the joy of it will never be the same. So that is where I feel that there is a void that is practically not possible to fill. But you can get somewhat closer to it, I guess, in your attempt.
Definitely, definitely, as close as we can to the language. So I'll again hand it over to you, Deyasini, for the rest of the
Yeah,
questions.
yeah,
Thank you so much,
yeah.
ma'am. It was wonderful to interact with you.
Thank
So
you, Megha.
enriching.
These questions really made make me ponder on everything that I've done so far. So thank you.
Yeah, so Bhaswati, Megha has already asked you about the voids in translation. Uh, so, as a student of translation studies, uh, we were always taught to maintain a kind of mediating stance between a metaphristic and a paraphrastic translation. Uh, what do you think are the other aspects of translation beyond the metaphrase, the paraphrase, and imitation that only comes with experience?
As best as I can. I would say, capturing the mood and atmosphere of a given work is often critical, and the best translations from all over the world do that. When I was working on my days with Ramkinkar Baij, I retained for it's a small thing, but I retained the expression "hey." He uses it a lot, when speaking with the author. Uh, he invites him in and welcomes him with the word "hey." So the two of them, they were engaged in a very free flowing conversation. These were not formal interviews in any way. So that expression, that informal expression, "hey," became a significant marker of Ramkinkar's personality and his convivial tone. And I've also been translating a book of reminiscences written by a friend of the poet Shakti Chattopadhyay. His name is Shomesh Sengupta. And I find this to be a very important aspect of the process. Shakti Chattopadhyay had a very diverse circle of friends, from Adivasis to Bauls, taxi drivers, to literary heavyweights of the day. So it was important for me to pay attention to the many moods and the different shades of personality reflected, in Shakti Chattopadhyay's way of talking, in how he communicated, in his poetry, and in his everyday life, to attempt to capture them in words. So I think beyond everything else that you pointed, um, this for me is becoming a core aspect of transferring to the reader of the translation at the essence of what has been said in the source text.
Thank you, Bhashwati. That was absolutely enriching. Uh, there is this line in your novel that keeps on whirring in my head. A perforated aluminium plate that sang stridently as the rain hit its face. What could have been a better way to celebrate and understand life? The protagonist of Victory Colony reminds me of my grandmother streaming into Calcutta with her brothers, widowed and orphaned, and all of them now sinking into the oblivion of the Alzheimer's disease. So this is perhaps how life degenerates into a pukish joke, but I always feel there is always a sense, so much more than we could have ever imagined and perceived in the very nonsense. So you were talking about Shukumar Roy's Abul Tabul. My grandmother used to read out the poems of Shukumar Ray to me at night, and she used to lull me to sleep. And uh, she's not given up on her habit yet. Just that she doesn't carry the book with her. And, at night flows out the rivers of pulsing light, her nonsensical registers, defying the morphological and syntactic bounds, resonating with life, uh, uh, of resonating with life, so much more of a life fully lived and that cannot be forgotten at all. I don't remember uh, growing up listening to tales of horror and violence, but that tiny glint of life tying the family across plates so that light throbbing on the mustard oil to be poured over the thankuni pata bata with which to savor the whole rice. Uh, so, if you could tell us how uh, the emanation of life, so brilliantly portrayed in Victory Colony, uh, fed your task sensibilities. Can you hear me, Bhashwati? I think there's a glitch.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Can
she's
you
back
hear me?
now.
yeah. I could hear your question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing that so openly, Dashini, and I can relate so much to your experience. You know, the anguish of it and also
Yeah.
the bittersweet of it. Uh, Among the many happy stories of our desh, you know, desh is both means a country and your native place in Bangla.
Mhm.
So, among the many happy stories of our desh that my grandmother recounted to us over and over again was the lushness of the orchards that she grew up around. And this
Mhm.
was quite a contrast to us, to me and my
Mhm.
brother, when we used to listen to these stories. Because in our
Mhm.
lower middle class life in Delhi, this sounded
Mhm.
like a dream, something I
Mhm.
could not relate to except as fantasy. Ironically enough, I got a tangible taste of my grandmother's Desh garden only when I migrated away from my Desh, which is New Delhi, to the west. Here, you know, in our backyard garden that my husband nurtures, I learned firsthand what abundant produce looks like as we, you know, bag tomatoes for co-workers and the fruits of our overzealous zucchini plant for our neighbors. And as I reflect on both our migrations, mine and my grandmother's, the irony of our journeys doesn't escape me. My grandmother's migration was forced upon her. It was not volitional. With the division of India, she lost her garden, her home, the entire
Mhm.
habitat that was once her universe. And my migration to the West happened largely out of choice. And it resulted in me gaining a garden, a home, and a whole new universe. So I started writing Victory Colony 1950 in Delhi. The idea was conceived in Delhi, and it must have come, from the countless stories I had heard from my grandmother, and they were not all horror stories, but they were stories of displacement in one way or the other.
Mhm.
So the seed must have, that way. And I started writing it Delhi, but most of the book was written in Canada. And I reckon that, the felt pain of displacement, even when it was voluntary in my case,
Mhm.
the pain is still there. It must have
Mhm.
informed my writing in more ways than I was conscious of when I was writing the book. So that would be my response to your question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bhaswati. Uh, this will be my last question. Bhaswati, with people, gastronomies too travel across space and time, and food being one of the significant cultural markers of identity. How do you think the facial becomes significant in the conceptualization of the self?
I think food for me is extremely important. It is, as I'm realizing more and more than being a marker of your memories or even
Mhm,
nostalgia, I now
mhm,
see food is extremely political, and for an immigrant, it's critical to
mhm.
be conscious of this, because even when I was writing my novel, and it is
Mhm.
probably littered with a lot of food references, and again,
Yeah,
that
Bhaswati,
happened
can you read
unconsciously.
from there? If you could read a few lines from there.
Uh, sure, I don't have anything open with me right now, but uh, if you can give me a few minutes, I'll
Yeah,
just
yeah, sure, sure,
yeah.
sure.
But I'll keep talking about it in the meanwhile. Just to
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that how important food becomes, because one is that it kind of keeps you rooted, however tenuously, to
Mm,
your past, but
yeah,
it is
absolutely.
also a marker of how you make adjustments to a very new place and
Mm,
your new environments, because this is one of the things that is reflected in the book, where
mhm,
the principal character, the female protagonist, she's a
mhm.
refugee from East Bengal, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
she has to get used to a new
Mhm,
palette altogether, something that she hasn't grown up with. So this is something that immigrants also experience on a fairly routine basis. So when you immigrate to a place where you do not have the familiarity, of the foods that you have grown up with, it can be it can be a big challenge. And I
yeah.
do know of friends, who are so fixed,
Mhm,
so they're so kind of rigidly rooted to
mhm.
their palate that they cannot make that switch at all. And even when they're traveling, it becomes they have to carry their the
Food.
staple thing. Yeah, like the curd
Mhm.
rice and the pickle has to
Mhm.
be there. Otherwise, they cannot
Yeah,
survive.
absolutely.
So I would say that, in that
Yeah.
sense, food is extremely important. It is not
Mhm.
just something
Yeah.
to romanticize. It is
Mhm.
also something to pay attention to, because of its very political nature,
Mhm.
when it comes to displacement,
Mhm.
particularly. And now I'll try to read
Yeah.
a little excerpt, if you would allow me.
Yeah. 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 Please. Did you get it?
Yes. Okay. So I will just read a small portion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So here in this scene, Amula, who is the protagonist,
Mhm.
she's in her in-laws' house, and
Mhm.
here this is where the food difference sort of
Mhm.
comes to the fore.
Mhm.
So this is how it goes. As
Mhm.
she had done the day before, Amula closed the balcony window when Manush left in the morning and opened the window overlooking the corridor. She employed a simple back and satin stitch pattern to emulate the design on a padded cream piece of cloth. She chose blue and red satin threads, red for the bird and blue for the fruits and branches. Working with needle and thread relaxed her in the same way as sitting by a pond or river did back in the village whenever she wrestled with the dilemma. Charuda brought lunch at the same time as the day before, and Omula even polished off more than half of the plate's contents without waiting for Manush. She still couldn't enjoy the food. Despite the best of meat and fish, which swam in liberal amounts of oil and ghee, Amula found it almost unpalatable. She longed for the simple food of her mother's and later Malati's kitchen. Panta bhat with a few fritters or fried small fish, a squirt of lime, and raw onion slices. On some days, runny red lentils added to the taste of the cool, watery rice. What could she not do to have a bowl of panta instead of this royal feast? Thank you.
Lovely, lovely. So beautifully written, Bhaswati.
That's
Uh,
wonderful. I'm not drooling now.
yeah.
Sorry for doing that to you.
Bhashwati, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing with us your wonderful insights. This was an amazing session. So with this, we end the conversation.
My heartfelt thanks to all of you.
It was great having you, ma'am.
Yeah.